in reviewing the response to my introductory video, the first big problem is that David didn't address my core assessment that he mixes categories and shifts interpretive gears midstream. David reframed my complaint as, "You're saying I'm not debating right," or you don't like my style, and you use big words. Well, that's evasive, folks. My point was not that he lacks polish and finesse. It was that he moves between literal, symbolic, esoteric, and psychological readings without a fixed set of rules. And so David said, "I do believe in all the layers," which is a point-blank admission of the very fluidity which I criticized. So, David, you did not refute my charge of your use of a straw man. You see, David says, in effect, that if Christ already came and the hope is fulfilled, then logically the Bible is not for us, salvation is over, and there's no point of reading it. But that is just him repeating the caricature in a slightly more developed form. You see, he never demonstrates that my position actually means the Bible is irrelevant, or that fulfilled eschatology entails hopelessness for later generations. He simply insists that this is the, quote, obvious, glaring reality. Sorry, folks, that's not an argument. It's a false dilemma dressed up as common sense. Now, granted, while some may say things like this, that is not what I teach, and I ask David specifically to address what I say and not blend in what others say, or don't say, what I say or what I don't say. Don't mix in what others may say and overlay that with my arguments. And you see, David wasted a whole lot of our time with irrelevant static. David didn't rebut my charge that his AI prompts were loaded. Instead, he gives a long narrative about how he used AI for a year, being chosen for an early rollout, training it, fighting with it, and finally getting it to see his point. But that story just reinforced my allegation. If he has spent months and months getting AI around consensus and into his framework, then the danger of steering the output is obvious. And that's exactly what I said. David's use of 2 Peter 3 in this reply is also very revealing. You see, he invokes it as though it plainly teaches a long delay, and even hints that it might not mean in their generation, while also using it to underwrite a 2,000-year kingdom pattern through Psalms 90 and Hosea 6. And thus, he reveals that he doesn't see the context of Psalms 90, a song for Moses, forecasting the judgment of Israel, and Hosea 6, which is dealing with the harvest of Judah. This is not a straightforward reading of 2 Peter 3. It is David's multi-layered theological reconstruction of all these contexts. He doesn't simply exegete the chapter. He fuses Peter, Psalms, Hosea, Revelation 21, Matthew 24 material, and his own millennium little season schema into one timeline. And that is a textbook example of conflation. Peter tells his audience of Jewish Christians explicitly who is about to be judged when he said, "There also came to be false prophets among the people, as also among you will be false teachers who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the one that bought them." Even denying the one that bought them, the master bringing swift destruction on themselves. And many will follow their destructive ways, through whom the way of truth will be evil spoken of, and by covetousness with feigned words they will use you for gain, for whom the judgment of old does not linger, and their destruction does not slumber. That's present tense. It is no longer slumbering. So, who would deny the Lord that bought them? Who did the Lord buy? Since Peter tells his audience that he's reminding them of the words spoken before by the holy prophets, well, let's let Moses answer that question. And you see Moses speaking to the whole congregation of Israel just before they crossed the Jordan into their inheritance, was teaching them the Song of Moses. And he said, "They have corrupted themselves. They are not his children because of their blemish. a perverse and crooked generation. Remember what Peter said on the day of Pentecost? Save yourselves from this untoward, that's the crooked generation. Same word. Do you thus deal with the Lord, O foolish and unwise people? Is he not your Father who bought you? You catch that? Is he not your Father who bought you? Who bought Israel? Folks, that was Yahweh. Has he not made you and established you? You see, Peter is predicting the imminent judgment of the body of Moses, Old Covenant Israel, and the destruction of Israel's heaven and earth, their temple praxis, as he is appropriating the predictions of Israel's judgment straight out of the Song of Moses. David repeatedly substitutes sincerity for argument. He says he loves truth, has prayed and fasted for years, has a personal testimony, is willing to be corrected, and wants unity. Well, you see, I'm not questioning his sincerity. I'm challenging his hermeneutic as to whether or not his reading of these texts is sound. But the biggest takeaway here, folks, is that he said he's willing to be corrected. And boy, howdy do I appreciate that attitude, because that is my attitude. You see, there's only two kinds of people who will never change their minds. Dead men because they can't, and fools because they won't. A wise man will be convinced with just one fact. But you know, a fool, he won't be convinced even with 50 facts. So we'll see which of these two David exemplifies himself to be when we see his response to my previous video on Acts 1:11 and Revelation 1:7, as well as this video. And so before we move into Matthew 24, we need to deal with something very fundamental. Because if this is not settled, if it's not square, level, and plumb, then nothing else will make sense. You see, I'm a retired contractor, and I used to build turnkey residential houses from the ground up. And the most basic fact is that if the foundation was not square, level, and plumb, then those problems would only get worse as the walls and the roof went up. You see, David repeatedly redefines the word generation to mean a race, stretching it across 2,000 years now. And so the problem is this does not help his position, because he is misusing genos and overloading race to mean something like all humanity, which neither term requires. Now, it is true that genea, comes from genos, all right? But that doesn't prove his claim. It's true that New Testament Greek words share common roots, but etymology does not control the meaning in context. Now, don't interrupt me here, David. I want you to listen to this all the way through, as I'm going to prove from Scripture what I'm about to say first. Genea means generation, a time-bound group, while genos, the root, means a kind, stock, lineage, a people group. And so, you see, David's first mistake is he is deriving the meaning from the root instead of the usage. You see, you don't define butterfly by splitting butter and fly. All right, so it's the same issue here. Genos does not mean all humanity. And this is the critical point. Genos can mean a family line, a tribe, a nation, a people group. But it does not automatically mean the entire human race. Let me give you an example. In Stephen's defense before the Alexandrian Jews who were put him on the spot, and he's defending himself, he said, a king arose who did not know Joseph, right? So after Pharaoh died, another Pharaoh came into power, and Stephen said, that king who arose did not know Joseph. Well, what did he do? This man dealt treacherously with our people, our genos. Well, who was that? It was the nation of Israel. It was not all humanity. You see that? So, even if Jesus had used genos it would still need contextual definition. And so David is equivocating on the word race. And this is where his argument is misleading. When he says race, then he quietly shifts between meanings. You see, the legitimate sense is lineage or ethnic group, and the illegitimate leap is all humanity across time, or at least for 2,000 years now. That's equivocation, folks. Now, again, even if genos were used in Matthew 24:34, it would not mean all humanity. It would still refer to a specific people group, like Israel. So appealing to genos, the root of genea, doesn't eliminate the time statement of this generation of Matthew 24:34. You see, David just muddies the water on it. And the issue isn't what the root word might mean in a vacuum. It's how the word is actually used in whatever text we're looking at. And so, ironically, bringing up genos exposes the very weakness of his argument, because if Jesus meant lineage, then he could have used genos, but he didn't. And if he meant generation, then he would have used genea, that's what he used, and so that's what he meant. And that shows intentional, inspired, divine word choice, not ambiguity. And so, David, you don't get to redefine the word Jesus used by appealing to a different word that he didn't use. So the question is simple. What did Jesus mean in Matthew 24:34 by this phrase, this time indicator of this generation? How does the Bible define the word genea contextually? Well, again, let's let Scripture answer that question. Pardon me, that's really part of my OCD. The camera's not plumb. So let's look at Matthew 1 and verse 17. This verse says, so all the generations, that's genea, so all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. And from David until the captivity of Babylon are 14 genea. And from the captivity of Babylon unto Christ are 14 genea. Now, just hold your horses right there. You see, the biblical usage, as you've just seen right here, generation here is something you can count. It refers to real, historical groups of people living in time, successively, sequentially, one right after the other. It is not an abstract race stretched across 2 millennia. And you see, this covers about a 2,000-year period of history. Do the math. That puts a generation at about 40 to 50 years. All right? And again, those are real, time-bound groups of people living through history. It is not a genericized race of humanity stretched across 2,000 years. So when Jesus says, this generation shall not pass away, then he's not talking about all humanity for the next 2,000 years. He's using the word genea exactly the way the Bible consistently uses it. And that is a specific group of people living in his own lifetime. If generation meant race, now catch this, folks. If generation meant race, then Matthew 1:17 would read 14 races from Abraham, David, 14 races, and 14 races. You see, that would just be absolute nonsense. All right? And that's the way David's redefinition of genea is. It is nonsense, with all due respect. So, right away, we have a biblical definition. A generation is a time-bound group of people. But now let's look at how Jesus himself uses the term. And so in Luke 17:25, Jesus says, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by this generation. Okay, so who is this generation? Well, who rejected Jesus, folks? And again, we don't have to guess about this. You look at Mark 8, verse 31, and it says, this is Jesus speaking to a multitude of people and his disciples. He must be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes. You see that? This is not a race of humanity spanning thousands of years. That is a specific group of people living in his own day. And that's why Jesus would say, this generation. And so when Jesus says this generation, he is speaking about the people standing right in front of him, the leadership of Israel in his time. Now, consider this, folks, and we're going to test David's sincerity and willingness to change when he's shown facts which refute his thinking. Let's compare what we have just demonstrated with Hebrews 3, 9, and 10, where the writer says, your fathers tested me for 40 years. Therefore, I was angry with that generation. I'm letting that percolate just a little bit. Did you catch that? Your fathers, that was Old Covenant Israel, tested me for 40 years. Therefore, I was angry with that generation. Now, notice the distinction. That generation is a past, explicitly defined group of people. The generation that came out of Egypt, who perished in the wilderness. There's only one group of people in only one period of time that can define. And so you've got to catch the power of this passage, folks. The Hebrew writer used genea to identify this specific group of people of a countable 40-year period of time. And he called it that generation. Did you catch that? He called it that generation, not this generation. You see, that generation was a specific group of people in the past, again, and this generation was the present living group of people, the people in Jesus' audience, who he told, there are some standing right here who shall not taste of death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And Jesus said to these very people that he said would reject him, he was speaking directly in the face, looking the Sanhedrin council right in the eyeballs. And he said, from now on, you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven, sitting at the right hand of God and coming in the clouds of heaven. That's not a generic race of people across all humanity, folks. That is a specific group of people. And so in both cases, this generation versus that generation, the word genea is being used contextually to refer to an identifiable group of people within a specific time frame, not a race, not a lineage stretching across all ages. And so again, if Jesus meant race, then he had the perfectly good word of genos to use, but he didn't use that word. He used genea, a word that consistently refers to a generation of people living at a specific point in time. David also blends another term with his sliding hermeneutic as he rips the identifier generation of vipers out of its context. The Greek noun translated generation by the King James translators is genemata, which Thayer defines as that which has been born or begotten, the offspring or progeny of men or animals, the fruits of the earth, the produce of agriculture. You see, the noun genemata comes from the verb geneo, which comes from genos. And so they're all in the same word family, but as we have learned, context and audience relevance determines the meaning. And so the question is, does the phrase generation of vipers refer to generic humanity across 2 millennia as David is using it? Well, if we look at Matthew 3 and verse 7, here we have John the Baptist, right? Preaching in the wilderness, right? And the scribes and the Pharisees, or the Pharisees and the Sadducees, on this instance, they come to him. They come to his baptism. And John says, brood of vipers. That's the New King James Version. All right. Brood of vipers, who hath warned you to flee from the wrath about to come? That's mellow in the present tense. We'll get to that, Lord willing, in the next video. All right. So the definition of this term becomes really interesting. Enlightening, you got to catch the harmony here. John, speaking directly to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, called them a brood, genemata, a brood of vipers. Vipers now. And so this is really interesting in light of what Jesus told these same Pharisees, that they were of their father, the devil, who was a liar in the beginning. Well, in the beginning, the devil was a serpent. How about that? Isn't that really interesting? But then Jesus himself identifies these same people as a brood of vipers. Matthew 12 and verse 34. He says, how can you, brood of vipers, how can you, being evil, speak good things? For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. But now watch this. As you go right on through that text, just a few verses, just a few minutes later, Jesus says, he answered and said unto them, an evil and adulterous generation. This is where they ask him for a sign from heaven. All right? And he said, an evil and adulterous genea seeks after a sign. Why would Jesus call them an adulterous generation? You see, that's a clue. He calls them an adulterous generation because Israel had violated the marriage covenant with Yahweh. Go read Jeremiah 3. An evil and adulterous genea seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. Now watch, for as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will rise up in the, with the definite article, they will rise up in the judgment with this generation, genea, and condemn it. Why? Because they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And indeed, a greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it. Why? Because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed, a greater than Solomon is here. Not to be Captain Obvious here, but Jesus just told that audience when the judgment would be. It would be in this generation. So you got to see these clues as you read along. And once you see them, you can't unsee them, folks. So in this one short little text, Jesus himself specifically identifies the Pharisees as the genemata, the brood of vipers, an adulterous generation because they broke the marriage covenant with Yahweh, and he used genea, and he identified them as this, using the demonstrative pronoun, this generation, not a race of humanity all across 2 millennia of time now. Now, when Jesus called the scribes and Pharisees the offspring of vipers, was he talking about a race stretched across thousands of years, or to the people standing right in front of him that he was talking to and about? Who kept asking Jesus, "Show us a sign from heaven"? Was that just humanity in general? Folks, anyone who can see through a ladder knows better. Now, genemata always refers to what is produced in a specific context, like fruit of the vine, offspring of a group, a harvest in season. It is never used for something stretched across thousands of years. It is consistently used in immediate, identifiable contexts. Now, you remember when Jesus gave his disciples the fruit of the vine, and he said, "Take this and divide it among yourselves." Was he handing them grapes from all across history, or the fruit of the vine in that moment, the genemata of the vine in that moment, in that setting? You see that? So when Jesus says, "This generation shall not pass," then the question is very simple. Does generation mean the people he was speaking to, or does it somehow magically mean a race spanning thousands of years? Something the word never means in that context. Again, folks, the answer is obvious to anyone who can see through a ladder, especially since Jesus identifies this generation as the generation which would see the temple torn down. And that is a non-repeatable event, especially in conjunction with the judgment of the adulterous generation, the adulterous nation of Israel, who broke her marriage covenant with Yahweh. There is no other generation. There is no other race of people that fills that bill, folks, than Old Covenant Jerusalem, Old Covenant Israel. Okay? So, we're waiting to see if David will be true to his word and demonstrate that he is willing to change in light of these facts.